Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Ebony Janice. I go by Ebony Janice, and today is Sunday. It's an ancestral devotion. I'm going to tell you a story about a lifelong dream that I've troubled a lot, that I used to think was just a childhood dream that turned into like a poem, that turned into real life, that turned into like actual inheritance. And it turns out that it was never just, this little girl dream. So when I was younger, I always wanted to live in New Orleans. Always, always. I had never been to New Orleans. My family's from Mississippi. I do have family from Louisiana, but I didn't know anything really in detail about that. I really, for the most part, just knew on my paternal side, my dad's family from Mississippi largely. But I used to, like, I remember starting like in high school telling my dad, like, I want to go to school in Louisiana. I want to go to school in New Orleans. And my dad being like, absolutely not. It just wasn't even on the table. It was like, absolutely not even applying to a school in Louisiana. It's just not even an option, period. And my dad said to me, those levies are not going to hold. My dad said that to me. And this is in like 1998, 1999. So, shout out to whatever was happening in my dad to have him be like, absolutely not. But my dad used to tell me these stories about how when he was younger and he would go to New Orleans, it was just so dangerous and da-da-da, whatever. And I always resisted that. I always thought, well, Dad, when I go to New Orleans, I'm not going to be in the same places that you were. You were a scoundrel. Like you were a teenager catching the train to like jumping on a train illegally to go to Louisiana and having to figure out how to get back home, like hoping some family member would bring you back home to Meridian, Mississippi. So my dad just always resisted it, never was about that New Orleans life. Years later, Katrina happened. I did have deep gratitude for my dad's whatever that inner wisdom was, because I absolutely would have been living there at the time, as far as my undergrad was concerned. And then years later, in 2020, I moved to New Orleans and I lived there for about 2 years, and I left after the last major hurricane. And it was a perfect timing for me actually to leave, because my mother's health was in like failing a bit, and or it was in transition. I don't want to say failing. Her health was in transition, and so it was good for me to be around the corner from my mom, because I currently live 8 minutes around the corner from my parents. Having said all that, I actually have never stopped saying that New Orleans is my favorite city in the United States of America. Ever, never, never. New Orleans is my favorite city in the United States. Like it almost feels like not the US sometimes. And everything, and I have to find the source of this, and so I'll put it in a caption. Everything you love about New Orleans is because of Black people. Favorite city in the United States of America. And okay, fast forward to now, and I've just completed a 64-day prayer dream protocol, and I actually thought that I was moving to Philly. Y'all know I'm an Eagles girl. I thought that I was moving to Philly. Come to find out, I am not moving to Philly. My dreams have been so crystal clear about me moving to New Orleans. There was a reconnection in a particular situation recently that maybe it was for the purpose of me just returning to New Orleans or thinking about New Orleans, or I don't know, like maybe that was the whole point of that situation. But for me to just be thinking about New Orleans, and New Orleans from day one of the 64-day dream protocol, New Orleans is coming up. I'm saying a lot of words to get to the ancestral devotion. I didn't grow up with my paternal grandmother. I grew up knowing who she was, but I didn't grow up having a close relationship with her. And a part of it is because my paternal grandmother, had some health challenges and didn't really talk a lot in my lifetime. And I have told some version of this story before. I think I flesh it out a little bit more in either Real Soft Girl Shit or the book that I've been outlining after that, but I'll tell this story very briefly here. My grandmother actually experienced a lot of abuse in her life, in particular relationships. And so when her children talk about her, they usually only talk about what happened to her. You could ask them, what was your mom's favorite color? And somehow they will start talking about what happened to her, what somebody did to her, And so I remember like feeling very frustrated about that, at which point I built my first ancestor altar several years ago, which only at that time had my maternal grandmother on it, who, Emma Jane, everybody know who Emma Jane is, Emma Baxley, my grandmother, Emma's legacy. But I grew up very close with that grandmother, and, I just, it was easeful for me to create an ancestor altar for her. And then, but I started thinking more about my paternal grandmother, about how, like, also I don't exist without her, but I don't know her. So I'm asking these questions and really interrogating, who is my grandmother? Who is this lady? And her children have failed her, like, radically in so many ways, because every single time they talk about her, they only talk about, like, what happened to her. All that to say, finally get one story from one of my aunts. She gives me this little piece of a story, and it is actually connected to New Orleans. It's connected to something that happened to New Orleans with my grandmother, but it's very, very brief. It involves a picture that ends up getting destroyed in Hurricane Katrina, so the picture doesn't even exist anymore. And so what I know is Zora Neale Hurston says that the rocks have memories. Toni Morrison says that if the rocks have memories, then the spirit has a memory. And so that it makes it necessary for us to learn to trust our spiritual imagination. That I know that if there's not a record of something, but it's something that spirit is calling me towards, that means that spirit must have information for me then. And then I have to trust spirit with that information. Help me, Holy Ghost. I'm actually helping myself about something completely different right now while I'm making this video. Having said that, my grandmother, I sit down and I'm going to venerate my grandmother. I put a picture of her on my altar and I start writing these stories about her, just kind of from my fantasy, from my imagination. And I take this one story that my aunt has given me that's connected to this picture that no longer exists anymore. And I use my spiritual imagination to tell the whole story, what was happening to lead up to that picture being taken. And backtrack. When I first made my ancestor altar, me and my sister lived together. And so my sister had come into my bedroom one day where my ancestor altar was, which actually isn't a thing that I would recommend, but that's the small space that we had. So I have my ancestor altar with our shared grandmother on the altar, because we don't have the same paternal, we don't have the same dad. So my grandmother, the grandmother that we have in common, is on this altar. My sister, she doesn't say anything, whatever. She's like, oh, okay, she's very Christian. So I do this, ancestral veneration, and I have forgotten to tell you the part of the story where the part of the reason too that I'm pursuing my paternal grandmother is because she is coming for me. Like in the spirit, in my dreams, she is showing up for me. In vision, she is showing up for me. That is a YouTube video for another day because it is a whole thing that involves a goldfish. Story for another day. But my grandmother, I do this ancestral veneration. I write this story. And at the end of the story that I write, my grandmother is grinning and giggling. That's the way that I write this story. Mind you, I have no conscious memory of my grandmother really ever giggling. She's very quiet. She used to talk with her teeth drawn together and a slight moan, and she would like a slight moan, and she'd be like, like she affirmed herself all day long. I be affirming myself too. So shout out to my grandmother for whatever reason she was like, because I think that she had a reason. I know for sure at some point my grandmother did have a stroke. So I had always attributed that affirmation to that stroke. Come to find out, it might just be something in our body. That to say, my sister comes back weeks later into my, she has seen this picture and she's like, okay, this is going too far and with the altar, whatever. And she's like, now you done added somebody else, whatever. So weeks after that, I done did all this ancestral veneration. My sister comes into the room and she says, I owe you an apology for what I said about your grandmother, Bernice, being on this altar. She said, because ever since she's been there, I've seen that picture so many times, and for the first time ever, it feels like she's grinning and giggling. I get chills every single time I tell this story because it's just so profound that my sister would use the exact words that I used in the story that I wrote in the ancestral veneration, healing work, clearing work, all those words to say, my grandmother is a part of my return to New Orleans because I'm moving back to New Orleans. My grandmother is a part of my return to New Orleans because when I lived there before, I don't believe that I completed what I believe she sent me there to complete. Shout out to the ancestors, even when it's exhausting arriving here.